Hello. So here we are with the second part of the monetary policy notes. I guess this is part 2A. And we'll continue these notes in next week before moving on to fiscal policy. The reading, of course, is chapter 22. For next week's readings, I'm going to load in this additional article that was in the that's on the Fed website, the St. Louis Fed website, and you may find it helpful. You're not obligated to read it. I think that the notes should be sufficient, but it's another resource for you. So in the prior notes, just by way of, again, setting the stage, we talked about what monetary policy is, some of the institutional structure of the Fed's functions, talked a little bit about being a lender of last resort, and started in, to a fair degree, talking about monetary policy. What we're going to do at this point is to inch closer to completing our discussion of monetary policy by defining what we mean by a Fed funds rate and thinking about how the Fed chooses its target for the Fed funds rate. So this comprises what we're going to be doing today, or in these notes. The rest, items 3, 4, and 5, are going to be in the next week. So what we have over the next couple of slides is really just some explanations. So when I have FFR up here, FFR is the federal funds rate. So what I want to get to is defining what we mean by the Fed funds rate. So federal funds rate is often shortened to Fed funds rate. And in order to do that, what we need to do is think about reserves. So the federal funds market, it is a market, is one in which commercial banks can borrow and lend reserves among one another. And the federal funds rate, FFR or Fed funds rate, is the nominal interest rate that a commercial bank is going to pay when they borrow reserves. In this case, again, in the Fed funds market and from another commercial bank. And equivalently, if one bank is borrowing, then another commercial bank is lending, and then the Fed funds rate would be the interest rate that they would receive. And again, by a commercial bank, what I mean is for most of you, this is where you would have your checking account, for instance. So Commerce Bank in University City and Clayton, Bank of America, other, whatever would be your bank, US Bank. Those are all examples of commercial banks. So commercial banks are going to interact in this market that's known as the Fed funds market, where they are trading reserves. So, in fact, these are overnight loans of reserves. And so sometimes the Fed funds market is referred to as the overnight market for interbank loans, because again, it is a transaction that is strictly an overnight borrowing and lending agreement, and interbank meaning it's between one commercial bank and another commercial bank. It's a the Fed funds rate is a market determined interest rate determined by the actions of these commercial banks, but it is influenced by the implementation of monetary policy by the Fed. And so this is the important part, that it's influenced by what the Fed does. So the Federal Reserve targets, and currently targets a range, but we can just say targets the Fed funds rate and conducts monetary policy to ensure that that target is achieved. And then we've already talked about in several instances what happens next. For a given level of inflation expectations, that's going to determine the short-term real interest rate. And then as the short-term real interest rate changes in an ISMP PC framework, you can think about the MP curve moving up or down. That should influence spending in the macroeconomy, either because it is directly related to spending that is influenced by short-term interest rates, or as we saw in the previous notes, changes in short-term interest rates might generally influence as well long-term interest rates and spending on things like houses with mortgages or cars with car loans. And so monetary policy is going to influence aggregate spending through the Fed's target for the Fed funds rate. So what I'm going to do is pause for a second here and just check your level of understanding. So what I want to do is think about why there is a market for reserves. Why is there a Fed funds market? So in order to do that, what I want to do is define what we mean by reserves. So reserves are the fraction of deposits that a commercial bank sets aside. Um, in the old days before the Fed, they would set that fraction of deposits aside in the vault. More conventionally now, commercial banks don't store a lot of reserves in their own on-site vaults, but rather in an account that they maintain at the Federal Reserve District Bank in which the commercial bank is located. So again, when a commercial bank receives deposits, so you go in, let's say, in an old-fashioned sense, you get a paycheck and you walk into the bank and you're going to deposit it. The teller doesn't, as I said in the previous set of notes, doesn't take your check and smile and say thank you and put it away in the bank in a special drawer with your name on it. In fact, of course, all of these deposits are bundled together, and commercial banks make part of their money by extending or part generate their income for their shareholders by extending loans. So a commercial bank has an incentive, of course, to set aside some reserves to facilitate the normal payments process. So again, when I write a check to my utility company, for instance, that has to be debited from my bank account and credited to the utility bank account deposit. And so holding reserves facilitates that kind of normal payments process. A commercial bank will have an incentive to set aside reserves as well to guard against unpredictable withdrawals, because it's not good for confidence if you go into the bank and you want to, say, withdraw $100, and then the bank says, oops, sorry, I don't have that right now. That tends to make everybody nervous. So sometimes when there are unpredictable withdrawals, or because withdrawals are not perfectly predictable, then commercial banks will hold reserves. And then finally, a commercial bank has an incentive to set aside some reserves to have funds available when there's unexpectedly strong loan demand. So again, if a potential borrower comes into a bank and says, I'd like to transact with you, and the bank says, oh, no, sorry, no can do, then the commercial bank has just lost a client and an income generating proposition. So another reason why a commercial bank would want to have some reserves is to ensure that it can meet client demands. But if you recall from the last set of notes, when we were talking about bank runs, historically, so not currently, but historically, reserves that were set aside didn't earn any interest income for the bank. And so banks had an incentive to minimize their reserve balances. And so this was one of the things that contributed, of course, to financial system instability, particularly when depositors would panic about the availability of their funds, and bank runs would ensue. So we talked about the lender of last resort function in the previous set of notes. Now we can introduce the application of another function, kind of continuing with our history lesson. The Fed used its supervision and regulation function to guard against these kinds of banking panics by mandating, in the old days, that commercial banks keep some required reserves. And then they supervised banks in order to ensure that they did, in fact, have the required level of reserves. So now, if we take our situation where you come in with your paycheck and you deposit it, the commercial bank was legally obligated to set aside some fraction of it. So, say you got paid $100, the commercial bank might have to set aside 10% of that, so $10 in its required reserve balances, leaving $90 to do other things with. So, what could a commercial bank do with deposited funds in excess of the required level? So, the $90 in our example. It could extend loans. And so it could lend to, of course, a creditworthy client, like a firm that wants to undertake an investment project or a person who wants to buy a house. But it could also lend to another commercial bank. And if it's doing that, it's doing so within the federal funds market. So the Fed funds market exists in order to allow a vehicle for commercial banks to trade these reserves that they have from a bank that might have an excess of them to, as we go to the final bullet point, a commercial bank that would need them. So, what could a commercial bank do if it had less than the required level of reserves? Again, the commercial bank is going to be supervised. There would be penalties that would be levied if the commercial bank did not have the level of required reserves that it was supposed to. So a bank had two options. One is that it could borrow from the Fed via the discount window and pay the discount rate. So this is kind of the Fed serving in this lending capacity. The other thing that a commercial bank could do instead, if it needed to achieve a certain level of reserves, is that it could borrow from a commercial bank in the Fed funds market. And the interest rate that it would pay would be the Fed funds rate. Now, the thing that is particularly interesting here is that the discount rate, that's what I mean by former, the discount rate is set by the Fed, and the Fed funds rate is the latter. It is influenced by the Fed, meaning via monetary policy. And so this will be something that the both of these interest rates and the relationship between them will be something that we take up in our discussion of how monetary policy is conducted in the second half of these part two notes. For now, what I want to do, though, is to think about how does the Fed determine its target for the Fed funds rate. So again, the Fed funds rate is influenced by the Fed, meaning that the Fed sets a target for the level of the Fed funds rate. And so what I want to do is consider how the Fed determines its target for the Fed funds rate. And to that end, we have this schematic, or this equation ultimately at the bottom, that is going to describe this. So we're going to dwell on this slide for quite some time. What I'd like to do is first of all to sort of give you the history lesson of why this constitutes an example of the Taylor rule and what the Taylor rule is. So John Taylor is an economist at Stanford, and in the old days, which is to say, before the Great Recession, the when the Fed didn't communicate its plans and targets very clearly, Fed watchers and other people who needed to make forecasts about interest rates needed to come up with a way of estimating the future direction for the federal funds rate. So it seems a little bit anachronistic now, I'm sure, if you're paying attention to the conduct of monetary policy, because there's all kinds of commentary on the part of Fed officials about what is going to be happening to monetary policy. But that was not the case, even as recently as the early 2000s. So Taylor noticed a pattern of changes in the Fed funds rate and then formalized it. Now, as I've tried to allude to, and we'll see in the subsequent set of notes, that since the Great Recession, the conduct of monetary policy has changed significantly. There's a clearer communication of the Fed's objectives and its plans for how it's going to achieve those objectives. There's a shift. There has been a shift in the Fed's priorities that away from some of the things that underlie the original crafting of the Taylor rule. So the Fed adopted an informal inflation target in the middle part of the early 2000s, and then formalized that inflation target in 2012, and then recently renewed its emphasis on high employment and a longer run inflation target. So monetary policy has actually evolved really significantly in the last decade and a half. And this will be some of what we talk about in the next set of notes. The third thing that's significantly different is that we're in a low interest rate environment compared to where we were, again, even just before the Great Recession, and a situation in which there are a lot of reserves in the banking system due to monetary policy actions that occurred during the Recession and then also more recently. And we'll see pictures of this in the next set of notes. And then finally, there are new methods for conducting monetary policy. So even if you had a macro class as recently as last spring, say in high school, there are new ways in which monetary policy is being conducted. So things that you learned are not completely wrong, but are definitely not the way in which monetary policy is most commonly conducted. And so we'll talk about that as well in the next set of notes. So, what was then, prior to the Great Recession, indeed more of a rule in that it was a good predictor, the Taylor rule was a good predictor of how the Fed funds rate would evolve. Since the Great Recession, it's become more of a rule of thumb. And that's why you see this language in the textbook. It's become more of a rule of thumb, not necessarily a solid predictor. And importantly, as we'll also talk about in the next set of notes, not necessarily a source of alarm when we observe the federal funds rate deviating from what this rule of thumb would predict. So again, we'll have more context for this in the second half of these notes that we'll take up subsequently. So what I want to do now is think about the rest of what's on this slide, and specifically what factors would go into the Fed's decision to establish its target for the Fed funds rate. So what I want to do is just label some things, and then that'll allow me to shift, hopefully, to these blank slides and talk about stuff. So I'm going to label this A, and this as well as A. This we'll call B. The third aspect of this, all of this, we'll call C, and then this D. And what I want to do is take up each of these things in turn. So what factors would go into the Fed establishing its target? So again, what factors influence the Fed's choice of a target? And again, now it's a target range, but we'll just say target for the Fed funds rate. And we saw that there were four things that were embodied in that formula, and we'll bounce back and forth between that slide and these notes. So the first thing that we identified was actual inflation. And the reason for this is we can say because the Fed funds rate is a nominal interest rate and a market interest rate, and because what drives spending in other words, consumption, investment, net exports especially, maybe, and perhaps, G, is the real interest rate. The Fed sets a target for the Fed funds rate with an eye towards targeting short-term real interest rates. Um, an eye towards targeting short-term real interest rates. And then again, as we suggested, as a generalization, when short-term real interest rates change, that percolates through to longer-term real interest rates. Not always, and it'll certainly be something that we take up when we consider the conduct of monetary policy. So that's this piece. So the Fed is going to set its target. So this is what it's targeting, but it needs to take into account the level of inflation. So then the second thing that the Fed needs to take into account is, or that it does take into account, is the real interest rate that would prevail if the economy is operating at its maximum sustainable capacity. So what does that mean? That means we're kind of thinking about in the long run, and maximum sustainable capacity means that the level of real gross domestic product is the potential level of gross domestic product, so that the output gap is zero. And we have, as a subtext, two other features. The actual rate of inflation is the expected inflation. And this is the Fed's target for inflation. So let me introduce some notation here. So in other words, we have the actual rate of inflation. So we've seen these two pieces of notation. The actual rate of inflation is the expected rate of inflation, and moreover, it is the one that the Fed is targeting. So for instance, right now, this is 2%. And indeed, in our examples, let's maintain that 2% target. And you can see this when we shift back to the slide. You'll see that's the 2% is in there. So when we think about the economy operating at its maximum sustainable capacity, we're imagining a situation in which the Fed has communicated clearly what its inflation target is. People say, okay, I hear you, and that is the rate of inflation I'm going to expect. And then we have a situation in which, if we think about the ISMP Phillips curve model, there is no output gap, so the actual level of inflation is that expected level of inflation. So what is this real interest rate? We've seen this. already. What is it? Where did we see it? We saw it in chapter 14 in the loanable funds market picture. Loanable funds market equilibrium interest rate is what we defined to be the neutral real interest rate. And it's the interest rate that balances savings and investment. So again, if we go back, you can see that we're going to come to this idea of an inflation target in a minute, but the neutral real interest rate is the one that would keep the economy neutral. And by neutral, what we mean is, no output gap, full employment, um, and how we think about the macroeconomy in the long run. So now let's turn to this item C. So what is the third thing that the Fed would think about in constructing its target for the Fed funds rate? Well, it would think about deviations of inflation from the Fed's target. And so this is a reflection of the price stability side. So reflects the stable prices side of the dual mandate. And again, our starting point is that the Fed is going to target a rate of inflation where its goal is that that inflation target is the one that people come to expect. So the Fed, Fed targets inflation with the goal that this is the level people expect. So in other words, we have currently in the US the targeted rate of inflation is 2%. So now let's think about the Phillips curve. When inflation is bigger than expected, when inflation is bigger than the level that's expected, and by implication, what we're thinking of is that this is the Fed's targeted level, then what we see is we have an output gap is becoming more positive, and the economy is overheating. Therefore, to slow the economy and to reduce inflation, the Fed should pursue contractionary monetary policy or raising real interest rates. And to slow inflation, the Fed back down to its targeted level, the Fed should raise interest rates. Now, what does that mean? That means that the coefficient on the gap, the deviation of inflation from its target, is positive. So this is saying the coefficient on this deviation of inflation minus the target, which in this case is 2%, is positive. How much should the interest rate change when inflation is different from the target? Well, here, as we can see, it's a half. So this coefficient, right, we have a positive sign, and that coefficient is telling us what degree the Fed is going to react when inflation deviates from its target. And so, where does that come from? Well, in the Taylor rule, it came as an empirical estimate. So again, Taylor's gathering all of this macroeconomic data and estimating what these coefficients should be. As we'll see when I conclude with the next part of this, we can also think about that coefficient as a reflection of the Fed's priorities for the dual mandate. So, in other words, how swiftly and how strongly will the Fed react to deviations of inflation from its target and deviations and the size of the output gap. So we'll turn to this in just a second. So what's our fourth element? Our fourth element here is the output gap. So the fourth thing that the Fed is considering is deviations of output from potential. In other words, gross domestic product from potential. And this is just another way of saying we're talking about the output gap. And again, if we think back to the ISLM or ISMPPC framework, this is we can kind of get a sense of what has to be happening. So what is this a reflection of? This is a reflection of the employment side. Of the Fed's dual mandate. So again, we can see if the output gap becomes more positive, then the economy is increasingly overheating and employment is rising above the maximum sustainable level. So let me write that down. So if the output gap becomes more positive, then we have the economy overheating, and we see employment rising above its maximum sustainable level. So in other words, above the level that we think of as being consistent with full employment. And again, to slow the economy and to shift employment lower, the response should be to raise the interest rate. So the coefficient on the output gap is positive. So slow the economy and shift employment lower. We do this via higher interest rates. So again, we observe that something about the coefficient. So the coefficient on the output gap should be positive. When the output gap is positive or rising, then the Fed's interest rate target should be rising, and vice versa. So again, we can go back to where we were. So here, oops, sorry. So here again, we have a positive number, and implied in here is that the coefficient is 1. And so where does that come from? Again, in the context of the Taylor rule, it was estimated, or again, we can think about it as a policy choice. The higher is the coefficient, the stronger is going to be the response of interest rates to any output gap. And that would mean that if for any the higher is that coefficient, for any deviation of output away from employment, we would see a sharper increase in the Fed's target for the real interest rate. And similarly, the smaller is the coefficient, the smaller would be the Fed's response to changes in employment in the economy. So what can we can do? We can kind of go through a little example. So as an example, if the actual level of gross domestic product is equal to potential, and inflation is the expected level and at the Fed's targeted level, then it has to be the case, and the Fed funds rate that's targeted minus inflation would have to be equal to the neutral real interest rate, or the Fed would set its target for the Fed funds rate at whatever that neutral real interest rate is, NEUT, neutral real interest rate, plus the underlying rate of inflation, which would be the expected and the targeted level. So to put some numbers in, why would this be? This would be because the output gap is 0 and because there's no deviation of inflation from its targeted level. So suppose instead, suppose the output gap is 0 but actual inflation is running higher than the targeted level. So actual inflation is 3%, and we're going to maintain this assumption unless you're told otherwise, that the Fed's target, because this is truth, the Fed's targeted rate of inflation is 2%. So the actual rate of inflation is running higher than the 2% target. So what would we predict for that the Fed would do? Well, we would predict that the Fed funds rate that it would target minus the inflation rate would be equal to I forgot a piece of information here. And let's suppose that the neutral real rate is equal to 1%. Then the Fed funds rate that it would target minus the rate of inflation would be equal to 1% plus a half times the deviation of the deviation of actual inflation from the target plus the output gap, which is 0. And so this would be 1 plus 1/2 would be the Fed funds rate minus the rate of inflation. And so therefore the Fed funds rate that it would target would be 1% plus a half of a percent plus the rate of inflation. So I just brought the pi over here. So this would be what, 4.5%, right? So that's how we would figure out what we would at least predict that the Fed might do. So based on this, let me pause and give you an opportunity to practice. And what we can see based on real live data is that the Taylor rule kind of as a rule broke down, as I said, with the Great Recession. So the Taylor rule, so here's roughly the onset of the Great Recession. The Taylor rule, which is the red, was predicting negative interest rates. The Fed did not adopt negative interest rates. And also, as the economy started to recover post-recession, the Taylor rule was predicting a higher interest rate or more tightening than, in fact, the Fed actually implemented because the Fed was looking at other considerations. So monetary policy choices are systematic, meaning that we tend to see this rule of thumb being an indicator of the direction of changes in the Fed funds rate, but it's not automatic. It's not a rule. And this is important and something that we'll take up at the very end of the conclusion of these notes. The Fed in the US is responding in a reliable way to the state of the economy, but it uses discretion in its choice for the Fed funds rate target rather than rather than using a simple rule. And again, it's looking at a whole host of variables and deciding how best to meet the dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment. And sometimes that requires adjusting interest rates in a way different from what this rule of thumb would predict. So directionally, we can see that the rule of thumb is not a bad indicator, but we can also see that certainly post Great Recession, the Fed has deviated from what this rule of thumb would have predicted. Now, the actual Fed funds rate, if you go to the Fed website, is called the effective Fed funds rate. So that's what we have in red. The target is what's indicated in blue. Notice that the actual or the effective Fed funds rate is in fact quite close to the target. So even though the Taylor rule isn't necessarily predicting what the Fed is doing, when the Fed is implementing monetary policy, it's quite successful in achieving its objectives. So beginning in 2010, in the wake of the financial crisis, rather than having just a single target rate, the Fed adopted a range. So you can see this range here and then this stair step up. So what we're going to turn to in the next set of notes is to think about how is it that the Fed is able to accomplish this? How is it that the Fed can choose a target for the Fed funds rate and then implement monetary policy so that it achieves its objectives? We'll do that in two steps. We'll think first about conventional monetary policy tools, and then we'll turn to thinking about unconventional monetary policy tools. Just by way of looking at a little bit more in current events, this is a shorter picture of the previous, and then shows events that have transpired over the last year. So you can see again, here is the implementation of the range for the target for the Fed funds rate. And the Fed funds rate effectively has stayed within this target for all instances except for this one little blip, which was an anomalous kind of one-day sort of shock in financial markets that you can read about or I can point you to if you're really interested. And you can see this period of time, we'll talk about in the next set of notes, is what was referred to as normalization. The Fed was trying to get back to uh, what it considered to be normal monetary policy in the wake of in the wake of the Great Recession, when it was implementing what's known as unconventional monetary policy. So this is also when President Trump was yelling at the Fed about how it shouldn't be tightening, blah, blah, blah. The Fed started to see some weakness in the macroeconomy and eased a little bit in 2019. And political machinations, the Fed sort of, or Trump sort of backed off a little bit of his criticism of Chair Powell. But here is, of course, the onset of the pandemic, and you can see the abrupt drop in the target for the Fed funds rate. It's on the lower level is 0, and the upper level is 0.25%. So what we're going to talk about is why that happened, and then what are the monetary policy tools that allowed that to transpire. So you will see in the next module that there are additional slides that describe the implementation of monetary policy. So I'll add to this slide deck and repost. And we will conclude this then in that week, along with moving on to discussion of fiscal policy, which is this material in chapter 23. So take care, stay well.